And with us today, he's a new assistant professor in our science, technology, and environmental policy area. Gabe has a really interesting background. When he was at MIT, he studied, I want to get this right, Earth, atmospheric, and planetary science, as well as political science. And then he went 2 subway stops away and has a degree from Harvard in public policy from the Kennedy School, which he received just a few months ago. And it's great to have him here. And it's particularly great that he's having time to speak with us today about this issue, because it's happening. It's happening virtually as we speak. Gabe has a lot of research areas, but we chose for this talk the area that is probably of greatest interest to this group, which is the whole issue of international climate policy. And Gabe has chosen to call his talk International Climate Policy, Where Are We Headed Next? So we'll sort of hear what you have to say, and then we'll be able to compare that with what comes up.
Yeah.
So,
predict the future.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me here. This is a really exciting opportunity to share some of the work that I've been doing and put it into the broader context of what is going on right now, this week, and the next couple of weeks in Paris. So this work's going to build off of the IPCC report. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, UN sanctioned scientific body. I was very closely involved in writing the chapter on international cooperation. So some of this will build on this work, which is a comprehensive peer-reviewed study of all the academic literature from every discipline that covers international cooperation. Then I'll draw some extensions to what's happened since this report came out early in 2014. Okay, great. So to give a brief overview, what I'll do first is I'll talk about climate change assessment in the context of the IPCC. I'll do this by explaining what the IPCC is and some of my thoughts on how this institution can be reformed, which might be interesting for those of us who think about how science influences policy. And so we have a paper forthcoming on the specific issue of how do you do scientific assessments in the climate context. Then I'll go into the meat of it. I'll talk about framing concepts for international cooperation, the different kinds of policy architectures, then think about how to link different kinds of policies across different jurisdictions and across different issues. Then I'll talk about what's coming next in this upcoming next few weeks in Paris, and then thinking about what's going to happen after Paris. How do we build towards more ambition? Okay, so first on the IPCC. The IPCC is an old institution. It goes back now more than 20 years between the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Program. Just as I mentioned, in early 2014, the 5th assessment report completed. This was a about 5-year writing process. And it summarizes all the scholarly literature broken into 3 fields: science, impacts, and mitigation. So across these 3 reports, each report has approximately 200 to 300 authors and consults about 1,000 external reviewers from either the academic NGO world, but also the policy world. So one common misconception about the IPCC is that this is the government's controlling science. So actually, the meat of the report, I brought the working group 3, this is the mitigation component. This report is actually barely touched by governments. So the majority of the content here is actually a summary of the science by scientists, and only in a very specific way do governments actually get involved in reviewing the scientific work and actually controlling what comes out. And that's only in what's called the summary for policymakers, which we sometimes call the summary by policymakers. But the rest of the report is actually really controlled by the scientists, and the only political influence happens through a few specific channels, indirect channels. So the IPCC remains highly legitimate. Its foundation as a scientific body under the United Nations guidance gives it a high degree of legitimacy. And this is really important in this contested space of climate science, especially in the international context. We think about how do you adjudicate not just the science, but also the ethical dimensions, the economics, how to think about what policies are appropriate in different contexts. The scholarly literature on that is contested. And so having the IPCC work through, I think, these social science issues, which it's really done seriously in the last few assessment reports, is a really hard task for a scientific body that's international and wants to maintain its legitimacy. So we've thought really hard about what this institution is. As an author on the IPCC, it's a very frustrating process. One of the most frustrating dimensions had to do with how authors are selected to participate. So because it's internationally legitimate, the authors must come from a geographically balanced set of backgrounds, right? But this means that it's not always the best scientists who are involved, and you have, it's not the best expertise, but it's the expertise that gives the institution a high degree of legitimacy. And so, oftentimes there's a pressure between, in the author selection process between geographic balance and conflict of interest. And so we saw this as being a real major challenge for setting up this institution. So we have a forthcoming paper I mentioned where we're thinking about how to balance the different criteria that should be involved in setting up a scientific assessment body like the IPCC. So we have a couple of very specific recommendations. Some of this is about managing conflict of interest. Some of it is about thinking about how to really solidify this interaction between policy and academic research. And we have some ideas about how to do outreach as well. So I won't go into this now, but just to give context for where a lot of this work I'll be showing is coming from. It's coming from this report that, I believe despite all of its challenges, is really scientifically credible and not just legitimate. Okay, so here are a few findings from the science chapter of the IPCC, just to give context so we're all on the same page together before we go into the social science on international cooperation. Okay, so the top figure might be familiar. It's the global average temperature change starting from 1850, the sort of pre-industrial era, through the current day from a number of different data sources. And so, this trend is quite clear that for a long time there are fluctuations, but the recent change in temperature is unprecedented in recent history. The below figure is a similar time period, the same time period with limited data, of sea level change. And this, so again, shows that from multiple different sources, these are the physiological, or not physical, the physical science measurements that we have of the Earth system. Okay, so this is reflected as well in less direct measures of impact. So the top figure shows atmospheric concentrations of different greenhouse gases, in green CO2, in orange methane, and in red nitrous oxides. And it shows, again, these stark trends. The dots are historical proxy measures using different things like ice cores and tree rings. And the lines in the more recent period are direct measurements, direct annual averages of different greenhouse gases. And we see these major uptrends in the most recent period. These are atmospheric concentrations. On the bottom are annual emissions. What's the relationship between emissions and concentrations? Well, about half of greenhouse gases, or at least half of CO2 that's emitted, stays in the atmosphere for on the order of 1,000 years. So you can think of the top figure as sort of the integral of the bottom figure. This is the concentration, these are the annual emissions. And this figure shows in gray direct atmospheric emissions, direct emissions from fossil fuel combustion and other direct forms of CO2 emissions like cement creation. And in yellow, forestry. So this is emissions from deforestation in big, mostly rainforests around the world. You can see again that there's this big uptrend that starts right around 1950. Okay, and so you can think, this is the sort of direct atmospheric measure of concentration, which is highly related to this figure in the corner here, which are the cumulative CO2 emissions. Right? So this shows over time, if you add up from 1750 to 1970, or from 1750 to 2011, the total amount of emissions that have gone into the atmosphere from these human activities. Okay. A few more figures just showing what's going on now. We're starting to move into the policy world now. That showed total human contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. This now starts to show where the political problems are going to be arising from. This is the geographic distribution of those emissions. So same figure as before, but now instead of direct CO2 emissions and forestry, this is now by country. Okay, so in blue is OECD. These are basically the developed countries. You can think of this as US, Canada, Europe. or most of Europe. Yellow are the economies in transition. This is basically the Soviet bloc, and green is Asia. And you see how the green really explodes in the last decade or two. Okay, so now this starts to illustrate where these political problems come from, but as I said before, it's not just emissions that matter on an annual basis, it's cumulative emissions. It's the historical trend in emissions that really matter for the amount of warming that's happening at any given period. So this shows, summed up over different periods, from 1750 to 1970, from 1750 to 1990, and from 1750 to 2010, the cumulative emissions from these different country blocks. And so now you see how this problem is really different. So whereas before, you can see that the Asia amount is pretty comparable to the OECD amount. When you add this up over the full period of industrialization, this is no longer the case, that the developed countries, the OECD countries, are still much larger than Asia, although this is changing as we go further. Okay, so now we're going to get, this also starts to raise some ethical questions, right? So this, so far, has all been just direct measurements based on physical data, but we're starting to see where the ethical and political challenges are going to start arising from. Okay, one more figure on just measurements. So this illustrates how the challenges are different in different regions. So you can think of this as income groupings, from low income to high income. And what are the sources of emissions? The text is really small. Yellow is energy, red is transportation, and green is forestry. Okay, so for the least developed countries, almost all of their emissions are coming from forestry. Right, that's over here. And as we move to higher income groups, energy becomes more and more important. This is a much more of a challenge focused on energy in yellow, transport in red, purple is buildings, and blue is industry. So the challenge is, when we think about what are the mitigation potentials in different countries, are really different when you think about different income groups. Okay, so now let's take this all together. Those were the sort of grounding facts in the natural sciences and emission inventories. How do we then take this into policy? So I'm going to start with some framing concepts. These are framing concepts that are quite general across different policy levels, so from local to international, and I think are quite applicable for different kinds of environmental problems, not just climate change, but we'll see how these are really challenging in this context. Okay, so first, climate change is a global commons problem. So before we move into sort of the specifics, this is a problem characterized by a global commons. This means that there's one atmosphere, greenhouse gases within about a week mix evenly throughout that atmosphere, and so it doesn't really matter at all where you emit emissions from. It all mixes relatively evenly. So this creates a common repository for emissions. And you can sort of think this in economic terms, the atmosphere is non-excludable and non-rival, meaning that I can't stop anyone else from using the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas repository, and I can't shield myself, or I don't feel any differential effects from climate change if you are also. This can also be characterized as a cross-border externality, meaning the actions that happen in my neighbor are going to affect me. Right? This is generally true for many environmental problems, but this is particularly true for climate change because it's a global problem. And then take this all together, this creates incentives to free ride. So sort of in the general economics literature, these are very interchangeable concepts. Global commons, non-excludability, non-rivalry, cross-border externalities, and incentives to free ride. Those are all things that are going to go hand in hand as implications of each other. And as sort of a fourth framing concept, this can be thought of as a public good. Right? So the atmosphere is a global commons. Using the atmosphere as a repository for greenhouse gases is a public good. Okay, so now we think about, in general, when we have a public goods provision kind of problems, what are the options for policy? So first, legal remedies. I think this was the lawyer's tendency to think about, okay, we have a common pool resource, let's create rights around it. Let's create legal remedies, for example, around loss and damages, or for, in this case, injunctive release, to make someone stop harming you through the global commons, or through the commons. And so one approach to climate policy may be legal remedies. And in fact, we've seen attempts to do this in several different places in the international climate policy context. The second inclination might be to move towards economic instruments, to try to internalize the externality. Okay, so this is following from COS or PIGU, depending on your perspective as an externality or as a public good. But this is the idea of using an economic instrument, price, carbon according to its marginal damages or according to a cost effectiveness sort of level, and then let the economic system play out, then the external cost of climate change will be internalized. And the third sort of approach would be using cooperative management. So this is kind of the Elinor Ostrom common pool resource management idea, that we can take an open access resource, and through cooperative processes where we have recurring interactions, we have trust, we have a common vision for where we're going, that cooperative management may just arise through these types of interactions. And this might be particularly true with a small number of actors. When we think about all the countries in the United Nations, it's hard to imagine sort of the Ostrom approach really applying there, maybe on a smaller scale. So this sort of gives us a framework for how we actually think about these problems in many different contexts for those public goods. Let's move closer to the environmental realm. Why is international cooperation here important? I think it's not a total given at first glance that this should be an international problem, right? There is a global commons, but why cooperation? So what are the challenges here? So one is that there are multiple actors that have diverse perspectives of costs and benefits of collective action, right? So this creates a problem, right? Where my perception of what it means to cooperate is different from yours, and so then how do we develop this into a framework where we're actually contributing what is fair or what is effective? It's a little bit abstract. We'll move into something more concrete soon. So emission sources are unevenly distributed, meaning if we don't capture the largest emitters, there's no way to get anything environmentally effective. The impacts themselves are heterogeneous, and so we think about who's causing damages and who's receiving those damages. They're not the same groups, right? And so this creates a mismatch between who bears the costs of mitigation and who bears the cost of not mitigating. And then also mitigation costs vary. So from with the economist's hat on, we think that when mitigation costs vary and they're contributing the same good, that there's a cost effectiveness problem unless those firms equate their marginal abatement costs. And so because mitigation costs vary, as we saw a few slides ago, the sources of emissions are very different. So mitigation costs will vary. I think that for a cost effectiveness framework, cooperation helps lower overall costs by allowing for mitigation to occur wherever it's cheapest. Okay, so organizing principles. We've taken all of these sort of basic concepts. How do we think about this as principles for cooperation? We've sort of established why cooperation may be valuable in an international context. How do we then bring people together, bring groups together? What values are they going to be arguing over? So the first is, I think first and foremost, are the economic benefits. So when we think about what is the right level of mitigation, there have been a lot of attempts to do a global cost-benefit analysis on global warming. That's really hard. There's massive uncertainties in the damages, but there have been some really notable attempts. The Stern Review, Bill Nordhaus's work on the DICE model have been attempts to try and figure out what is the right level of global warming. I think one of the facts that comes out of environmental economics is that the optimal level of pollution is almost never zero. Meaning that there's some benefit to the first unit of emission always, and that marginal benefit could be quite large. So we think about the optimal level of global warming. It's not zero above pre-industrial. I think even the most, the strongest environmental advocates now are on 1.5 degrees Celsius change or 350 parts per million CO2. This is a very ambitious goal, but it's not zero. And so we think about what's the aggregate net benefits, what's the right balance between costs and benefits. But as I said, this is a very hard problem. There are massive uncertainties. If the Greenland ice sheet collapses, that could lead to very different damages globally, and we have no idea how likely this is under different temperature scenarios. I think the best guess puts it between 30 and 80% probability after 2 degrees warming. And so how do you make a decision? How do you do a cost-benefit analysis in that kind of framework? We just have no idea if these tipping points are really likely or not under different warming scenarios. So this framework of cost effectiveness moves the debate away from what's the right level of global warming to what's the best way to achieve a given target. And so the international community has really coalesced around this idea of cost effectiveness, now moving away from the right level of warming. There's been a consensus around that. Okay, so sustainable development, this is a concept very much interlinked with global warming, climate change policy. Sustainable development is on a parallel track in international negotiations. We could talk about that for a long time as well, but the process to develop these so-called sustainable development goals is very linked with climate change, but does operate in a parallel process. But this is one of the operating norms under which climate cooperation happens, and in fact sustainable development is explicitly mentioned throughout these sort of norm-setting documents negotiated in climate change negotiations. Third, and this is where things are going to get really sticky now, when we move towards actual implementation, what's politically feasible, equity is going to manifest itself in many different ways. So first, intergenerational, intra-generational, meaning equity across different generations over time, and also equity within a generation across different countries and communities. These are going to be primary concerns about setting the cooperative agenda moving forward. Related to these, now this has been conceptualized in a few different ways in the climate context. One is burden sharing. This is the idea that there's a global burden that must be met, sort of thought of as if we agree on the cost-effective, if we agree on the target, the cost-effective policy sets a global burden, the total amount of CO2 that should be reduced, and then allocates who pays for that burden. And so this concept of burden sharing has grown as one of the manifestations under which equity is going to be discussed in climate negotiations. A very related concept is carbon budgets. This is the idea there's a finite amount of carbon that can be released to meet a certain carbon target or a certain temperature target, and then how that's allocated across countries is going to be based on equity principles. Equity is also manifested in not just outcomes but also procedures. Are negotiations happening in a way that's equitable? Are voices being brought to the table in a fair way? This was a major contention in the Copenhagen Agreement, where a lot of the sort of meat of the agreement was hashed out in a room with just 8 leaders and then brought to the rest of the plenary to talk about. So procedurally, equity is also very important. And then finally, climate negotiations has been an arena where international norms have been hashed out for a long time. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992 developed a very succinct and powerful distillation of these equity principles and what has become to be known as common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And this, if you read it really carefully, which everyone involved in these negotiations has, is a really powerful distillation of a lot of these ideas. The common responsibility being the shared atmosphere. The differentiated responsibility, which implies that based on historic actions, different countries will have different responsibilities towards that common goal. But not just responsibility, but also capability is built into this, that different countries have different capabilities of responding to their responsibility. And so this is a very powerful and complex distillation of these equity principles. And it's been operationalized in a number of different ways, which we'll see. Finally, fourth, I've listed another guiding principle that can guide climate action, which is precaution. This is what's called the precautionary principle. And this has been another mode where, particularly in cases of high scientific uncertainty, the precautionary principle has been used to say, let's think about an approach to policy that tries to avoid the worst risks. And again, this is another kind of organizing principle where the actual implementation has been seen in many different ways. In some cases, there's been a lot of this sort of comparison of who takes a more precautionary view, the European Union or the US, in relation to new technologies. So for example, the EU ban on GMOs is sort of seen as a really good manifestation of the precautionary principle. But in many other cases, the US sometimes has also acted more precautionary than the European Union. Okay, so let's take these. These are organizing principles. Now let's think about this in a slightly different way. Can we take these and develop evaluative criteria? We're going to be thinking now about many different frameworks for policy. Over the last 10 plus years, there's been a lot of experimentation and evolution in the kind of policy framework. But before we dig right into those, I think it's worth thinking about how do we know if we have a good policy? What are the different ways to evaluate an international climate policy? And this might not be the same way you would evaluate a national climate policy or a local climate policy, where these different criteria matter in different ways. So first is environmental effectiveness. Is it achieving its goal in terms of emissions, concentrations, or impacts, or resilience? So on the environmental side, first and foremost, this is a climate agreement. Does it achieve environmental goals. Second, on economic performance, is it doing it in a cost-effective way? Are the net benefits greater than the net costs? So are the benefits greater than the costs, or are the net benefits positive? Then distributionally, what are the impacts across different groups? Does that match responsibility? Does it match capacity? How do we think about rights in this context? When we think about, for example, small island countries who have very little emissions but will bear a lot of damage, how do we think about their rights? And then equality, sort of as a manifestation of equity, are these costs equal across different communities, regions, generations? And then finally, this is probably what I would argue is the most important criteria for thinking about international climate policy, and that's institutional feasibility, right? Is this agreement something that can be worked out? And so I think this is probably the biggest evolution in where we've gone. We've gone from a framework in 1992, 1997, the Kyoto Protocol, where environmental effectiveness was put first, economic performance was put second, and institutional feasibility was put last. And now we've gone in sort of the reverse, where institutional feasibility has been put first, and maybe economic performance is second. We'll see, but I think we've sort of flipped the negotiations on their head in terms of which criteria do we try to satisfy first. Okay, we'll get more into that, but this is sort of laying out, before we dig into the meat, how should we think about these different kinds of policies, or how could we think about these different kinds of policies? Okay, so now we've explored how to evaluate policies. Now I want to talk about the possible space under which climate cooperation has happened and could happen in the future. So when we think about different kinds of policy architectures, the sort of general guiding themes have been some sort of spectrum from what's been called top-down to bottom-up. Top-down meaning very strong international coordination. Authority stems from international bodies. And bottom-up meaning authority stemming from national authorities, maybe even subnational authorities. And so we think about the different frameworks that have been applied to the global climate problem. We've seen centralized approaches and decentralized approaches. And others have argued that we should be looking not just at this dichotomy, but at hybrid approaches, harmonized approaches, ones that have polycentric levels of government, meaning centers at the international level and many centers at the national or subnational level. I'll get into examples in just one slide. And then also, not just, the taxonomy should not just span where authority comes from, top-down or bottom-up, but also what are they cooperating over. Climate change has had cooperation over pure norms and also over pure technical mechanisms for achieving things. So this is another dimension. Okay, so these are now going to be operationalized in this quite complex figure. And I'll walk through this all. So on the x-axis shows the different forms of cooperation on that first dimension. Where is authority coming from? Is it decentralized or centralized at the international level? And the y-axis is talking about what is the cooperation about. Is it about ends or is it about means? Okay, so one very clear example, the UNF's CCC objective. This is the objective to achieve, to prevent dangerous anthropogenic harm to the global climate. This was a norm agreed upon in 1992 under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is a goal, so it's pure ends, and it was done only in the multilateral UN context, so it's centralized authority to set a goal. Then we think about the exact opposite, regional emission trading schemes. These are policies agreed upon at a decentralized level amongst a small region of countries, just on means. What are going to be the mechanisms by which we're going to meet our targets? Not saying what the targets are, but that we're going to have emissions trading to achieve those targets. So the EU emission trading scheme is a good example at this end of the spectrum. Then we have everything in between. And we sort of think about where are we headed, or where have we been so far? So the Kyoto Protocol has been the dominant piece of international climate negotiation for a long time. This was signed in 1997, went into force in 2005. I'll say a little bit more about it later, but the general idea was to set legally binding emission targets for developed countries and no emission targets for developing countries. But those targets you can think of as cooperation over the ends. They were explicit emission targets. For example, the US's was, I think, 7% below 1990 levels by 2012, something on that order. it was a cooperation over ends agreed upon in an international multilateral context through centralized authority. So the Kyoto targets end up here. But the Kyoto Protocol also included a lot about flexibility over how to meet those targets. Countries had a lot of options to do that, and so those flexible mechanisms fall more under cooperation over means, but still negotiated at centralized authority. So this shows the range of possibilities, and in orange are things that have been tried out. In blue are things that are proposed, and this pledge and review is basically where the negotiations are headed right now. You can think of that there has been cooperation that spanned this entire range of policies. The international community has been at this for quite a long time, and basically everything has been tried already. And so this is why I put evaluation first and foremost. As we think about how effective has this range of policies been, we need a way to evaluate that. Okay. So one way forward is policy linkage, and this is important both empirically because policies are being linked, and also has some theoretical reasons why it could be important too. It could help build towards ambition, and it could improve some of the performance criteria, particularly cost effectiveness and institutional feasibility. So another complex figure, but this figure, the point of this figure is that this is a complex area of policy. This shows the different organizations that are formed around climate policy right now at different scales. So you just sort of think of this as a bullseye. Right in the middle is the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at the international level. Then as you go out, it goes to regional and then subnational. And it shows that there are different kinds of organizations that span scales and that are connected in different ways. So, for example, other environmental treaties like the Montreal Protocol. This is an international agreement that has a linkage to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Right? They have an agreement over how they're going to count different gases. And in fact, the Montreal Protocol is doing a lot in support of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Then we have subnational or regional policies. So for example, California's AB 32, which is its own cap-and-trade system, or the New England states cap-and-trade system, or the EU cap-and-trade system, are all policies that are spanning the national and regional level and have some international linkages as well. So for example, the EU emission trading scheme recognizes permits from the Kyoto Protocol's clean development mechanism. So there's this really complex set of policies that are linked in a lot of different ways. And the point of this is that because this issue has become more salient, because, as I showed before, all of these different attempts have been made, there's been a decentralization of authority anyway. Right? So this hope that there could be one international treaty that sets globally binding targets for all countries, it is really hard to imagine when you have this many other competing institutions and organizations trying to vie for a piece of this puzzle. And then thinking about how to link all these things also becomes really hard. And so just, I think, over the last 15 years, we've seen this proliferation of what some researchers have called this regime complex for climate change, that we have this really complex set of overlapping institutions with authority that does not have clear lines. And so hashing out how these organizations work together is a major challenge for thinking about this kind of policy. And it's kind of, there's already this proliferation of authority-making bodies in this area. Okay, so here's a really clear example of policy linkage, and this continues to be a really important area that we'll see moving into the discussion about Paris. So under the Kyoto Protocol, as I mentioned before, developed countries assume legally binding targets on their emissions, and developing countries did not. A major problem with Kyoto was that several developed countries, even though they had targets and were party to the Kyoto Protocol, did not follow through with those targets in domestic authority. So in the end, the Kyoto Protocol covered about 15% of global emissions. This doesn't mean that participation was limited only to the developed countries. Participation was actually open to any country through these so-called flexible mechanisms. So the Kyoto Protocol had a provision called the Clean Development Mechanism. This was kind of added in the last minute into the Kyoto Protocol, and it allowed developing countries to host mitigation projects such as renewable energy or building efficiency, or making their industrial plants more efficient, and receive credits for that by selling emission reduction credits to the developed countries that did have legally binding obligations. So to put this into a picture, this is kind of what it looked like. The Annex 1, the developed countries with emission reduction obligations could send money to developing countries. The developing countries could do projects that reduced emissions and send credits to the developed countries, and that allowed them to meet their legally binding targets. This mechanism really took off. This became an extremely huge area of money transfers and emission reduction transfers. And so this broadened participation. Developing countries could get credit for mitigation activities under the Kyoto Protocol. So in one sense, this was really good for institutional feasibility. Right? It made it such that it allowed developed countries to take advantage of heterogeneous costs, meaning they could go for the low-cost mitigation opportunities in developing countries. And it broadened the scope. It allowed developed countries to start to address these really rapidly growing emissions in countries like India and China. There are a lot of problems with the Kyoto Protocol Clean Development Mechanism. Some of my research has been exactly on this topic, and one of the big challenges has been verifying that these reductions are actually happening outside of one's jurisdiction, right? And this is going to be a recurring theme when we think about Paris, is that how do you actually monitor activities happening outside of your jurisdiction, especially when you're paying for them? And so this was a major challenge with the Clean Development Mechanism. But institutionally, it did broaden participation. Okay, so we've seen this kind of linkage already. So any country with obligations under Kyoto were then linked indirectly through this Clean Development Mechanism market. Since Kyoto, there's been a big recognition that the emissions from developing countries like China and India really matter if we're going to address emissions globally. China is the world's largest emitter now by quite a lot. India is growing very rapidly, and we think about how do we really address this global commons problem. China and India's emissions are going to need to be addressed in quite a meaningful way. So there's been this evolution since Kyoto through the Copenhagen negotiations in 2009, and Cancun, and then Durban, to expand participation to all countries. This was obviously extremely contentious. The developing countries in non-Annex 1 did not have obligations, and so this process to bring them under the umbrella of the United Nations framework to have emission reductions was really contentious. We think about how to operationalize this concept of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. You know, the big argument has been respective capabilities means developing countries don't need to reduce their emissions in a legally binding way. We'll take action, but we won't do this in a legally binding way. So this common but differentiated responsibility was used as a long time to push back against this expanded participation for developing countries. So participation has been broadened. There's going to be linkage across all countries now as we move forward into Paris. But in parallel, while all this has been happening, there was a lot of frustration with the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol only covered 15% of global emissions. And so in the meantime, negotiations for climate change have happened in many other multilateral fora. So other UN forums have been really influential in shaping climate policy now. So the United Nations Environment Program, the United Nations Development Program, and the Montreal Protocol have all done a lot to start addressing greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, the Montreal Protocol has reduced more emissions than the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. These sort of highly potent ozone-depleting gases have had, reducing those has had more of a climate impact than anything the Kyoto Protocol has done. Meanwhile, other multilateral fora not under the United Nations have also become very active in this area. IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Association, the Major Emitters Forum, or the Major Economies Forum, the Group of 20, the G20, and the International Energy Agency have all really started to address climate change, and many, many others. This is a small list. And then finally, I think what's also been very interesting to see has been cooperation among non-state actors. So one kind of activity is public-private partnerships. One kind is private sector governance. Another is NGOs. I think what's also very interesting is subnational, transnational cooperation. This means cooperation amongst non-nations, like many cities cooperating together, like the ICLEI group that some of us So this shows that there's been a lot of linkage between many different kinds of organizations and different kinds of countries, but also I think really fascinating, we've started to see climate change being linked to almost every other international issue. So development, human rights, international trade, biodiversity, natural resource management, ecosystems, just to pick a few, are now closely linked to the climate regime. And this is where we sort of see at the international level a lot of activity and excitement to do more things. And so a lot of these other issues have tried to latch on. I think now if you want to do biodiversity conservation or anything related to biodiversity, if you don't have a climate change slant, there's basically no way to get international support for that kind of activity. So all these activities are increasingly linked. Even a lot of development now is very closely linked to the climate regime. Okay, so this illustrates in a picture how linked these systems are. So, despite the limited effect of the Kyoto Protocol, there's been quite a lot of linkage amongst policies. California is linked to the Quebec system. EU is going to be linked to the Australian system. The Chinese systems are linked with each other. And then through the Clean Development Mechanism, every other country is linked to the EU system and anything else linked with the EU system. So there's been this really sort of bottom-up kind of architecture that's arisen through these linkages. And so this has been another really interesting thing to see, where there was this architecture that was very top-down heavy. The Kyoto Protocol developed a centralized authority. In the absence of its effectiveness, or maybe in parallel with its limited effectiveness, there's been an upswelling of bottom-up activity that's now been linked. And so you've had this kind of harmonization across these bottom-up policies. So this is really interesting when we think about Paris, where the framework will be very much a bottom-up focused initiative, but through these linkages we might have harmonization that gets us some of those advantages of international cooperation that we started with. Okay, so now let's move into Paris, and then we can have a sort of discussion about where you guys see this going to. So these are my own views. So the main backbone of the Paris Agreement is quite clear at this point. It's going to be a system of what are called intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs. You can think of these essentially as voluntary pledges of emission reductions or actions. Countries are going to name their own goals. This is quite clear. The framework is going to be each country proposing its own set of goals and activities. And they can take many different forms. These can be goals of absolute emission reductions. These can be goals of carbon intensity, meaning CO2 per GDP. They can be renewable energy targets. So this whole range of kinds of pledges is going to be really hard to reconcile. One thing that is good about this framework, so I would say in my normative view of good, is that these INDCs have been mostly linked to national priorities, national domestic authorities and priorities, meaning the United States has only pledged to do what it can do under existing legislative authority. We'll talk more about the U.S.'s pledge, but in general, most of these countries are pledging what is already domestically feasible. We saw that was a big challenge in previous frameworks, was that countries would agree to something internationally and then have no domestic support at home to actually implement these things and make them institutionally feasible. And so this is going to be the main framework. It's going to be around these INDCs, thinking about how they're going to be comparable, how to build these up, how to think about them in a cooperative way, and they're just going to be pledges put into an international document. That's not going to be all. Clearly, these INDCs are going to be supported with other forms of cooperation that will attack substantive issues like the legal force, what's going to be the legal framework for this document, the role of technology, how are technology arrangements going to be made such that developed countries who have more advanced, for example, renewables, how are they going to get that into developing countries? Monitoring, how are we going to know that emission reductions are happening when they say they're happening? And finance, who's going to pay for all of this? I'll go into each of these in a little bit. But let's first look at one of these INDCs. So this is the U.S.'s INDC. It's 2 pages. It's actually a page and a half. And this has, one of the most influential things the U.S. has done in international climate negotiations in a long time was pledge a absolute level target on its emissions. They pledged to go 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. And they submitted this to the United Nations. if you look at the meat of this, this is going to be achieved through three things. One is CAFE standards. These are the fuel economy standards on cars. Two is the Clean Power Plan. These are regulations on existing power plants. And three are appliance standards. So the U.S. is going to achieve this through existing, almost exclusively executive branch authority. So the Clean Air Act, this authority comes from 1970. This authority comes from a series of reforms, mostly in 1970, and appliance standards are 2005. So these are all things that happened way before Obama really started thinking about this. Okay, but then, you know, through these existing policies, he's able to tweak them. The Clean Power Plan is this really incredible legal gymnastic move to get a 1970 piece of legislation to go here. Okay, so ambition. So the big problem with this INDC framework is that these are bottom-up pledges, voluntary pledges to an international community. How have we solved the free rider problem at all? Right, so we started at the very beginning with these different notions of the global commons, free rider problems, and different approaches to managing that. You know, how is a series of nationally determined voluntary pledges going to overcome this big overriding incentive to free ride on the actions of others? Okay, so in other words, how will this become globally ambitious or environmentally effective? This is what people have done. So there's now a whole industry of NGOs and think tanks who have taken all of the INDCs, which now cover more than 90% of global emissions, which itself is an incredible feat, and have said, what does this get us in environmental effectiveness? This is not a trivial task. You know, the U.S. has pledged something very easy, an absolute emission reduction by a certain year. That's not at all the case for other countries, particularly developing countries who have pledged things like China. They will peak their emissions by 2030 with the ambition to move sooner. Or you know, India, which has pledged a carbon intensity goal. And so now the actual emission levels depend on all these other assumptions like GDP growth, population growth. How will all of those things factor in on what we really care about, which is global average temperature change? So a lot of assumptions go into figures like this. There are a lot of competing NGOs and think tanks trying to do this. This is a good one. This comes from the Climate Analytics Network, which relies on some good European think tanks. They show historic emissions. Blue is their projection for business as usual. And then red shows what you get with the full set of INDCs that have come out so far. And you can see that it starts to bend over the curve in emissions, but it doesn't get to the range that has been agreed upon sort of under international norms. So you get to this 2-degree target. A 2-degree target would imply emissions in this yellow area, but the current set of INDCs are only there. Okay, so you know, I think there's general consensus among all of these think tanks that the level of ambition is not commensurate with the international norm of 2 degrees C. So how do we actually get there? And that's going to be the big question. Is Paris will be the first step where these INDCs come together, and then the real magic is going to happen after Paris when these INDCs get revised and hopefully lowered. Okay, so building ambition is the last topic, and I think here is where I'll get a little bit speculative about where I think we're going next and how to get those INDCs to be more ambitious. Okay, so one is, I'm going to start with an observation, which is that INDCs are being created, and I think ambition in those INDCs are being created no longer in the international fora, but more in the bilateral and multilateral, small multilateral settings. So first and foremost, I see the U.S.-China bilateral agreement from earlier this summer as being really important in developing both the U.S.'s and China's ambition in its climate pledge. So for a long, for I think 3 or 4 years, the U.S. and China had been secretly having talks about how they were going to address climate change. As the world's 2 largest emitters, they spent a lot of time thinking about this. They had both been basically vilified for a long time in international climate negotiations, and they were ready for that to be over. So together they worked together and hatched out this very impressive piece of diplomacy where the U.S. would agree to its emission reduction target, and China would agree to peak its emissions, and there was a whole set of complementary pieces that made that work. Right? So I think basically single-handedly, the U.S. Applied international pressure to get China to reduce its emissions. Now, there are a lot of reasons why China wanted to reduce its own emissions. Mostly, I think, due to sort of political stability concerns around local air pollutants, which are highly correlated with CO2. But I think this additional international pressure from the U.S. to frame environmental policy as a climate change policy and then bring this out in the international sector in a big way, I think that was a lot of the U.S. pushing. And I think this really matters because when the U.S. and China agreed to their bilateral agreement, very soon after, a lot of countries piled on and said they were going to raise their ambition too. The U.S. has also struck a bilateral agreement with India, not as in the news as the U.S.-China bilateral, but still quite important. And like the China-U.S. bilateral, this had a lot of other components in it. This worked, I think both of these bilateral agreements work because there are a lot of incentives built in. So for example, in the U.S.-China bilateral, there was an agreement to set up a suite of joint R&D centers where technology would be developed, applied to the climate context, and that was seen as a big win. Actually, it was, I think, seen as a win-win for both countries. The U.S. would get access to the Chinese markets, the Chinese would get access to the U.S. technology, and the cost of mitigation would be lowered. And so I think these other pieces of the puzzle, the technology pieces, the finance pieces, this all fits into these bilateral agreements, and I think that really works to build ambition in these contexts. So there's also a France-China bilateral that just was announced last week. China has announced some cooperative efforts on finance in developing countries through this, it's called the South-South Climate Fund. And there could be more. I think we'll see more of these because the issues of negotiation are much more palatable. And I think these win-win opportunities are seen much more in the bilateral context than this massive multilateral context. But this doesn't mean that the multilateral international negotiations are going to be meaningless. I think there are a number of concrete things that are going to happen in Paris and beyond that are going to try to build ambition overall amongst these INDCs. First is on technology. This is a really key point in negotiations. We're thinking about how do we reduce emissions in developing countries. Technology has to be a key part of that. Right? We sort of think that we want to lower the cost of mitigation everywhere. Technology enables that. But at the same time, technology has this really challenging appropriability problem. Just like climate change, the knowledge embedded in technology is a public good, and it's very hard to keep it appropriable. That's code word for IP is going to be really hard in a technology agreement. Two is finance. So under Copenhagen in 2009, developed countries agreed to mobilize $100 billion towards climate change mitigation and adaptation simply. But this was a huge amount of money, and it was very ambiguously agreed upon. It was to mobilize $100 billion. That was, diplomatic language to basically say we will figure out if this is public sector or private sector. Is this going to be actually new and additional, or is it going to be reclassified development assistance? So there's a lot of wrangling over what this climate finance number is going to look like. Obama has reaffirmed his pledge to contribute $3 billion, and Congress has already said they're not going to authorize that. And so we're going to, this is going to be a domestic battle as well as an international battle over the right amount of climate finance and the right distribution of donors and receivers. The third is emission offsets. So as I mentioned before, in the context of the Kyoto Protocol, emission offsets broadened participation. It allowed for a lot of this climate finance to flow from developed to developing countries to pay for emission reductions. It's yet to be seen how this is going to play out in Paris. I think there's a lot of skepticism around how the Kyoto Protocol did emission offsets. But this was really important, I think, for certain key countries like China and increasingly India to get climate finance and technology and sort of credit for what's going on. So how these emission offsets are going to work in the Paris Agreement, I think, will be really interesting to watch, particularly because it overlaps with these other goals. Offsets are a form of climate finance. Will these be double counted? Offsets are going to actually be activities that could potentially be counted in both developed and developing country INDCs. When Europe says it's going to meet its cap and trade system, what it doesn't say is that it's going to meet a certain fraction of that through these offset programs that are actually emission reductions happening elsewhere. But of course, if you're hosting those emission offset projects, you'll also count that in your INDC. So there's a potential that these offsets will be counted twice in the INDCs and also twice in finance and offsets. So how that gets worked out will be seen. We're in the sort of framework of just bottom up, everyone's throwing as much as they can at it. If we really want to know if we're getting somewhere, I think the right kind of accounting is really important too. Okay, and here's where I think is probably one of the biggest sticking issues for what's going to happen next, which is policy and emission surveillance. So this means surveillance on others' policies and others' emissions. So I don't know if you guys saw last week, the New York Times ran an article that China's coal consumption was actually 17% higher than previously reported. Meaning that basically all of Germany was in China, we didn't know it. So there's this huge amount of emissions have basically gone unaccounted for. And so now when we think about, we're in this framework of relying on norms of accepting responsibility to build towards ambition. If we don't even know what other countries are doing, how do we develop the right set of norms to do something more ambitious? Right? If there's this constant doubt about what's actually going on in these very large emitting countries, then how is that going to create the confidence to have other countries move forward? And so we're sort of in this game where surveillance is going to play a really key role. And I think there are a lot of interesting analogies in sort of thinking about surveillance when we think about other kinds of policies like nuclear disarmament. Think about how do we actually measure sort of what's going on in these other countries. When we think about our actions are contingent on your actions, we actually need to know what those actions are with some precision. So surveillance will be really important. A related issue here is comparability. These INDCs are coming in at very different languages and very different forms. And so being able to compare those are really important too. If I want to know how ambitious I'm going to be, I want to know how ambitious you are and how much responsibility you're accepting. And so making these comparable is going to be a major task for, I think, NGOs and other sort of third-party analysts. Okay, and the last sort of approach could be trade measures. This was seen, I think, before as one of the few sticks that could be used in international negotiations. We've seen trade measures used a lot in, again, nuclear disarmament policy. But trade measures, again, could be used here. We think about what the U.S. has tried to do in the past. When the U.S. had a cap-and-trade bill that passed the House, one of the provisions in that was a border adjustment tax where any industry competing with a domestic industry would basically have to pay for the embodied carbon in that product at an equivalent rate to what the domestic firm had to. And so we can see these trade measures also improving so that countries feel safe in implementing a more strict climate policy without having to worry about competitiveness. All right, so just to recap, my own views are that I think Paris is going to successfully establish a cooperative framework. These INDCs have already come in, as I mentioned, covering more than 90% of emissions. So I think we're already there on getting that framework worked out. These complementary policies are going to then form, I think, over the next decades, and that will be what builds ambition. These complementary policies and normative pressures to do more, to actually fulfill historic responsibilities, are going to help build towards that ambition. But what's really hard to reconcile is that this is a marathon, not a sprint. That these emissions are cumulative. It takes a long time to decarbonize. These power plants have long lifetimes. All this infrastructure being built is going to last a long time before it's paid off. And so that this sort of the perspective that's needed is one of a marathon, not a sprint. And that's really hard to internalize when a lot of these problems are being caused by cumulative emissions too, so that every emission emitted now is going to still be up there. At least half of them will still be up there in 1,000 years. And finally, I think one of the guiding principles that I think has been really correctly accepted is that ambition without feasibility is not actually ambitious. This has been sort of the fault before, and now at least we have the feasibility, even if we don't have the ambition.
Well, thank you
Yeah.
very much. Let's give him a hand. Let's have some questions and comments.
One response to all this is that the geophysical system is so complex, and the policy system to handle it is so complex that we better recognise that we're not going to be able to achieve what we want, no matter how ambitious we are. So that I guess the consequence of that is to start thinking even more seriously about adaptation. You didn't mention adaptation at all in your presentation. I wonder what kind of thoughts you have about that and what is likely to emerge from Paris with regard to...
Yeah.
Maybe you could briefly explain, I mean, Peter knows and I know what adaptation is. Why don't you say something?
So adaptation is the idea, well, it's a very ambiguous concept actually. It's the idea that climate change is happening and that damages, either economic or just in general utility damages are going to happen, but through specific measures called adaptation measures, those damages could be reduced. So, a very clear example, sea level rise is happening. You can build a sea wall, and that helps you adapt to those impacts. And so that for a given level of sea level rise, there is less damage if there's some adaptation towards that. So one of the reasons I didn't talk about adaptation is that we were explicitly barred from covering adaptation in the IPCC. That this was, the Working Group 3 was not allowed to cover adaptation. In fact, no group was really allowed to really tackle adaptation. And that's because politically it's very hard for this moral hazard problem. That if we have done adaptation, then we will maybe do less mitigation because we can just adapt to it. So there's a big concern, I think, politically about doing too much on, putting too much focus on adaptation.
Sure.
But that's, the flip side to that is that adaptation will be really important and could be a much more cost-effective way to reduce the damages of climate change than mitigation, particularly since so much is already embedded in this high momentum system. So adaptation finance is going to be big. Part of the finance is not just on mitigation but adaptation. But adaptation also has a lot of the opposite characteristics of mitigation. It's not a public good, right? And so we think about who benefits from adaptation. It's wherever the money's being spent. It's not, doesn't have the same kind of free rider problem. So the politics are really different. And the politics of adaptation look a lot more like the politics of development, but maybe with an even greater dimension of historic responsibility.
And so in that sense, isn't it going to be, potentially easier to handle?
I think potentially it could be harder. I think it would be a very different challenge because imagine the politics of the U.S. not paying for a global public good, but paying for preventing damages in other countries. I think that's a really hard political problem.
Well, it does it through development anyway, doesn't it?
Right, but this is like, I think the numbers are, would be additional to that. And development's already a hard sell in America.
To follow up with that, if the IPCC is not allowed to look at adaptation, is there a board that does look at adaptation?
Yeah, so I think in the next IPCC they are going to look at adaptation. I think that's going to be one of the changes. But the World Bank does a lot on it, but not in the same kind of way, not like a sort of survey of all the peer-reviewed literature. Another big problem is that adaptation is not really well defined. So when you think about, one of the biggest climate change impacts will be on the food system, right? And there's a lot of research about agriculture, how to manage droughts, how to manage, pests, and those things become more likely, but sort of not necessarily on a step change kind of way, but just droughts last longer or they happen more frequently. And so a lot of research about adaptation may not be called adaptation. So it's kind of, it's a hard problem to think about from the scientific assessment perspective too.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, what is the current level of carbon trade that is happening globally? How far are we in terms of
On cap and trade?
On carbon trade, yeah, that's one.
Yeah, so the European Union has a cap and trade system.
Right.
That covers about 45%, I think, of the EU's emissions.
Okay.
California has a cap and trade system. The northeast states of the United States have a cap and trade system. And there's proposals in many different places to do cap and trade.
The other thing is how well is
And China, sorry.
How well is climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction embedded in that report? Is it mainstream? You put them together or something?
Yeah, so the impacts of climate change are studied in a lot of the physical science detail in the Working Group 2 report, which is a report almost twice the size of the Working Group 3 report, just on impacts. And they've done a lot on the regional level, but just almost exclusively on the science. So they have, this report has 16 chapters. The impacts report has something like 25, 30 chapters, and one is about the economics, but it's not about the policy of it.
But question is, like disaster risk reduction, is it mainstreamed in, do you put them together when?
Yeah, I think similar to the agriculture problem, that there's a lot of research on disasters and sort of disaster mitigation, and some disasters definitely become more likely under higher temperature scenarios, but that linkage is not always explicit. Yeah.
When you consider the subnational activity, and I've always been fascinated by, say, state level activity, California's 8th largest economy or something like in the world. So you can make a case that there is a feedback effect. But is the general case that's made based on people not really understanding the impact of local efforts, or is it because they're so largely in conjunction with more palpable environmental amelioration that people experience?
Yeah, I think this concept of co-benefits is really important for the politics of these things. And so when we think about climate policy on the national or subnational level, co-benefits are how these things are sold politically. So this is my favorite moment when the U.S. was passing its cap-and-trade bill in the House. Nancy Pelosi came up in front of the whole House right before the vote, so minutes before the vote, and said, "This bill is about 3 things: jobs, jobs, and jobs." And it's kind of a crazy thing to think about it, because basically it's it's a charge on carbon emissions, and to say that this is a jobs bill is kind of crazy. But you look at all of these environmental bills, a lot of them are sold on, in the EU, it's a lot about getting more renewable energy out there and becoming energy independent. Or, it's about creating the economic benefits that come along with growing industry. Or in China, it's about reducing particulate matter, a lot of people think. And that those are the real drivers of climate policy. And thank God these are correlated with climate change, or else we'd never do anything.
Well, the third one I understand. The others, are, well, they could be true. Any other?
Gabe, what's you talked about the moral hazard of not wanting to talk about adaptation, or at least your group being specifically barred from talking about that formally. Have you noticed any type of increase, side room chatter about geoengineering, which of course has its own moral hazard?
So exactly. The geoengineering is like even crazier moral hazard problem, and it has the reverse free rider problem too, where there's one group who's done a cost-benefit analysis on geoengineering. So just say geoengineering is the idea of there's several different techniques. There's what's known as solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal. Solar radiation management is the more dire one, where reflective particles can be injected into the atmosphere and reflect sunlight directly. And so this is the idea that you can just cool the planet. So when there have been these giant volcanic explosions that have launched a lot of sulfur into the atmosphere, Earth cools down for a couple of years while those are up there. So this is a concept. If you do a cost-benefit analysis on it, it is so cheap to inject sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, and it's so effective in reducing emissions that the net benefits to the city of Venice are positive, meaning unilaterally it's in Venice's interest to lower global temperature so that it doesn't have sea level rise and lose tourism from that. So it has the opposite free rider problem, where the question becomes, how do you stop countries from applying this before the risks are known? Because it could be in any one country's interest, or even perceived interest, to do this. So there is a lot more discussion about this, and the moral hazard problem is really big too, because if we have this ability to reduce global temperatures, we may do less mitigation.
And you don't even need a state actor for it.
Right, exactly. You
Bill Gates will wake up tomorrow and
exactly.
decide he's going to fix this.
Yeah, exactly. Or you think about Bangladesh and India, who share a border, and Bangladesh is already below sea level. It could be in their interest. interest too. It's extremely cheap.
But it's the precautionary principle that applies.
Yeah, absolutely, but it's like, you know, a lot of analogies to other policy areas where you have this reverse free rider, but you can think about nuclear disarmaments. Like, how do you stop other countries from using a technology is a very different problem for international cooperation. I think one really interesting thing is that there's no agreement yet even on how much should be learned about this technology.
I guess we do have time for one more, Julie.
I'm curious to have a little bit more clarification on the INDCs. Are these coming in by country?
Yeah.
Have they been submitted already? And what is the speculation on how they look?
Yeah, so almost all countries have now submitted one. I think I checked, it's like 95, 96% of countries and about 95% of emissions are covered now by an INDC. They take many different forms. You know, as I said, the US's was a page and a half. I think India's was substantially longer. I think something like 30 pages. I'm not exactly sure. And they take many different forms. They have many different pieces to them. And they can kind of say whatever they want to. In general, they're supposed to give a target and then some indication about implementation so that they become credible targets. Different think tanks have suggested what is a good INDC and what is a bad INDC. A good INDC has existing authority to actually implement these things, or a politically feasible path forward to implement these targets, and they're ambitious and they're fair, and you know, but they're all online. You can go on the UN website and look at them all. Every country has submitted a press release with their INDC too that you can find.
Well, this has been a terrific session. Thank you. I want to remind people that we have a lot of these over the course of the year. We're not going to have one 2 days before Thanksgiving. We decided not to this year. It's a little too close. But the Dean, Eric Schwartz, will be talking on December 8th on U.S. policy towards Syrian refugees, which I think should be of great interest to people. So please come again, and our thanks again to Gabe.
Thanks. Yeah.
I did my master's thesis on nanotechnology geoengineering. It's been interesting to see. There's not a lot of talk about it.
Well, and it's hard to talk about the experiment on a small scale. Oh, like you don't have to work it out. And then you're like, dude, I saw off the legs of the table.
There's a lot of really good economics on this. I think one of the challenges of this is international cooperation.
We'll see if it becomes